Hilchos Kiddush Hachodesh Perek Tshi'i, the laws of sanctifying the new month, chapter 9. Today's chapter and tomorrow's chapter are, if you look in the context of these halachot, they're not really here nor there. The whole beginning of Kiddush Hachodesh is the Rambam explaining to us how the calendar was made and the system that was used to decide the new month and leap years. Starting on Shabbat, chapter 11, through the end of these chapters, are going to be the complex mathematical calculations that would determine whether the moon could be sighted on the night of the new month. This chapter and the next chapter, which we're studying today and tomorrow, are all about the solar cycle, which doesn't really have to do with the Jewish calendar, but in a way, as the commentaries explain it, it's like an addendum, an addition, nispach, as we call it in Hebrew, to the concept of a leap year. Since what determines a leap year is the difference that accumulates between the solar and lunar cycles, so it's important to know more about the solar cycle, about how long it takes the sun to revolve around the earth per year, because that will determine how much ahead it is of the moon, and it will also determine how the leap years should be added into the calendar. So essentially what's going to happen is, today the Rambam is going to give us one opinion of the length of a solar year. That's called in the Talmud Kufat Shmuel. Shmuel was one of the greatest sages, and he had an opinion as to how long the solar cycle was and all the results that come out of this understanding. Tomorrow, the Rambam is going to give us another opinion, which is called Kufat Rav Ada. Rav Ada was the proponent of the second opinion, that the solar cycle is a bit shorter, and then we're going to have all the results of that. And again, the point of studying all this is that when you understand how long a solar year is, you'll understand how that affects the making of a leap year. It says the Rambam Halacha Aleph, Shnas Hachama, the solar year. Yesh mechachme Yisrael sho'imrim. There are those among the sages of Israel who say, Shehi shloish me'es chamisha v'shishim yoim u'reviya yoim, that it's exactly 365 days and a quarter of a day. Shehu sheish shois, 6 hours. This is actually the amount that we've been going with until now. When I described to you in earlier chapters how long the solar year is, this is the number that we used. 365 days and a quarter. But there are those that say that it's a bit less than a quarter of a day, as we'll see tomorrow at length. The Rambam says this isn't a Jewish argument, this is an astronomical argument. The sages of Greece and the sages of Persia also had this argument as to how long the solar year exactly is. So the Rambam says today we're going to go with the first opinion. Halacha Beis. The one who says that it's 365 days and a quarter of a day, he is the one that will hold Yishoyer mikol machzer shel 19 shana shah achas ve'arba me'os u'shmeinim v'chamisha chalakim. He's the one who holds that after every 19 years, there's still going to be a difference between the solar and lunar orbits, which is 1 hour and 485 units, as we've said. In other words, every couple of years you make a leap year to have the moon catch up with the sun. After 19 years, it becomes almost as aligned as it can be, with a difference of just 1 hour, but there's still a difference. A tiny difference, but there is a difference. So that's what the Rambam says over here. The first slide, the top line is blue. According to Shmuel, the length of the solar year, in other words, the time it takes for the sun to complete a revolution around the earth, is 365 and a quarter days. And the next slide will be the discrepancy between the solar and lunar orbit after a machzor, after 19 years, will still be somewhat of a small difference. 1 hour and 485 units, just under an hour and a half. The advantage, though, to this cycle is that because the solar cycle is an even number, it's very easy to divide the 4 seasons of the year. V'yiyeh bein tkufa litkufa, between one season and the next. The word tkufa literally means making a round, because the sun goes, like hakafa, sun goes around the earth. At every quarter point of the circle, we call it a tkufa. In English, we call them equinoxes or solstice. The word equinox means when it's equal, because since the sun's orbit is at an incline to the equator, so at the 2 points that the sun meets the equator, it's called an equinox, because it's equal, it meets the equator there. And solstice in Latin, sol means sun, and stis means stop. Because at the 2 points, the most northerly and the most southerly points, that's where the sun is at its maximum distance relative to the equator. So vernal equinox summer solstice, autumnal equinox, winter solstice. That's the tkufot, the 4 quarters of the sun cycle. So between one tkufa and the next will be echad v'tishim yoim, v'sheva shayis v'chatzi shah, exactly 91 days, 7.5 hours. Okay, I skipped a little point here, which the Rambam will bring up later. That is the annual discrepancy. Right? Every year between the solar and lunar orbit, there's a difference of 10 days, 21 hours, and 204 units. Every couple of years, we make a leap year to take care of that. And at the end of every 19 years, we still have the hour and 485 units. The length of each tkufa, the length of each season, is exactly 91 days, 7.5 hours. And if you think about that, 91 days is divisible by 7. So if you know when the beginning of a certain season is, all you have to do is add 7.5 hours, and you know which day of the week the next tkufa will be. Because 91 days always goes back to 7. So if you know that Tuesday at 6 p.m. was the first tekufa, the beginning of the first season, just add 7.5 hours, 1:30 a.m., Tuesday night, will be the next tekufa on a Tuesday. You don't know which day that's going to be. That you have to do the math, count 91 days. But you know which day of the week it's going to be. The moment you know one beginning of a season, at what day and what hour it is, you just begin to count to the next beginning of the season. That's after it. And from the second one to the third one, till eternity, you can just go and count 91 days, 7.5 hours, and you keep on adding, and that's when you have the next tekufa, the next season. Now, the Rambam gives us the names of the 4 tekufot, the 4 seasons. Tekufas Nisan, the equinox, that's called the vernal equinox, the equinox that takes place in the spring, Hi hasha ve'hachelek, is the moment, is the hour, and the unit within the next hour, shetikones by hashemesh bereish mazal tle, when the sun enters the beginning of the constellation of the sheep. It's called Aries. Here you can see somewhat of a representation, right? You have Earth in the center, you have the 12 constellations all the way around. That's like the backdrop that the sages identified to identify the movement of the planets against it. That's how because otherwise you can't say where the sun is. You have to have a backdrop in order to identify movement. If I'm saying my finger is moving, so it's moving against the backdrop of my other hand. And then I can say where my finger is relative to my hand. So the same thing was with the stars. The sages identified 12 groups of stars, and they said, that's how we're going to decide where the sun and the moon is. So the moment the sun begins its journey at 0 degrees, maybe I have an arrow here, right there. When the sun enters this point on its orbit, so it's beginning its journey through the mazal of Taleh, through the mazal of Aries, that's when Tkufat Nisan is. That's when we call the beginning of the spring. Utkufas Tammuz, the summer solstice, that's called in English, the second season, Heyois Hashemesh Bereish Mazal Sartan. That's when the sun gets basically a quarter of the way through in the constellation of what we call today Cancer. So you see, it will make its way on its orbit, 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 90 degrees. And now it's at the beginning of Sartan, at the beginning of Cancer. This is when the second season begins, because that's when the sun is most northerly away from the earth, away from the equator, excuse me. Utkufas Tishrei Heyois Hashemesh Bereish Mazal Meznayim. Then we go, summer solstice, what did I say? Yeah. Then we go another quarter of the year, again back to the sun's orbit. It travels 120 degrees, 150 degrees, now it's at 180 degrees. This is when it reaches the beginning of what's called Mazal Moznayim, Libra, the scales. That's when Tkufat Tishrei begins. That's the autumnal equinox. It's back to the equator on the other side of the earth. Tkufas Tishrei Heyois Hashemesh Bereish Mazal Meznayim. That's when the sun reaches the beginning of the constellation of Libra. Then you go another quarter of a year, and this one is missing from my screen. But basically, when the sun gets to 270 degrees, and it reaches the beginning of Capricorn, the fourth season, the winter solstice, begins when the sun is at the beginning of the mazal known as Gedi, the goat, or again in fancy English, Capricorn. Now that Rambam says something that's going to require a little bit of explanation. Utkufas Nisan, hoisa bashana harishayna shal yitzira, lefi cheshbein zeh. According to this calculation, the very first tekufa, in other words, the beginning of all our calculations, in the first year of creation, according to this calculation, was koidem moilad Nisan, preceding the molad the first conjunction of the month of Nisan, b'shiva yamim v'teisha shois v'sheish meyes u'shnayim v'arbaim chalakim. By 7 hours, 7 days, 9 hours, 642 units of the next hour. Simana, the sign for this is Zat Tarmab. Zayin Tes, 7 days, 9 hours. Tarmab, 642 units. So what does this mean? I'm going to try my best to clarify this. Please try to follow along carefully. The Talmud says that we begin counting molads and tekufot. In other words, we identify the first conjunction of the moon and the first beginning of the journey of the sun in a time that was pre-creation. It's called tohu. For the purposes of making our calculations easier, we go pre-creation. We begin the journey pre-creation. Now, for molads, for the moon, we begin counting from Tishrei. For the sun, we begin counting from Nisan. That's just the way it is. Okay, the first molad is a molad of Tishrei. The first tekufa is a tekufa of Nisan. And again, they're both pre-creation. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to work forwards, and then we're going to work backwards. We know, here are the two facts that we know. We know that the first molad, from which we begin counting, all calculations, is a molad of Tishrei, and it happened at Sunday night, 5 hours into the night, 204 units into the next hour. We learned this in chapter 6. It's called Baharat. If you want to convert it to modern times, it's about 11 p.m. We know that the first tekufa, in other words, when the sun first entered 0 degrees, was on Tuesday night, 0 hours, 0 units. The beginning of Tuesday night, 6 o'clock p.m. But again, because the world was created in Tishrei, this is a pre-creation tekufa. It's an imaginary tekufa. We're just using it for the purposes of calculation.
You're starting with Tishrei.
Again, for the...
What's a year before?
Yeah, well, for the sun, we're going a half a year before. For the moon, we're going a full year before. Technically, theoretically. Okay? Now, using the tools that the Rambam has already given us, how to calculate the distance of time from one mola to the next, or from one tekufa to the next, let's calculate what would happen a half a year later. For the moon, if the molad of Tishrei is on Sunday night, 5 hours, 204 units, if you go a half a year later, 6 months to Nisan, again, it's still pre-creation, when would the molad of Nisan be? If you follow the system of 29 days, 12 hours, 793, as we said, you go 6 times, you get to Wednesday morning, 9 hours, 642 units. 3:36 a.m. Okay, it's like Tuesday night, late Tuesday night, early Wednesday morning, 3:36 a.m. If you take the sun and you go ahead 6 months, now you're already in creation, in the week of creation. When was the tekufa? When did the sun reach Tishrei? Right, that's 6 months apart, the autumnal equinox. When did it reach the equator again? On Wednesday morning, 15 hours into the day, 9 o'clock a.m. So while the sun, moon, and stars were, according to the commentaries, were actually created on Tuesday night of creation, the sun only began to move at 9 o'clock a.m. at 180 degrees. Tekufas Tishrei. Going ahead with the molad also, let's go another 6 months to the first actual molad that was observed on this earth. From Wednesday morning, 9 hours, you go ahead 6 months. You'll reach Friday morning, 14 hours into the day. As a matter of fact, the Talmud says, Adam Harishon, when he was created, was the first one to be Mekadesh at Hachodesh. He was the first one to sanctify the new month, because after he was created, he witnessed the first conjunction of the moon and the sun. Okay? So we have 3 stages pre-creation, 2 stages post-creation. And again, because we know the starting point, we're able to work forward. Now, all of this only reveals days of the week. It doesn't tell you how far were these weeks apart. We just know if this is on Sunday night, then 6 months ahead is Wednesday morning. 6 months ahead is Friday morning. If this is Tuesday night, then 6 months ahead is Wednesday morning. But now that we've figured out when the actual observable post-creation tekufa and molad were, now we can work backwards to ascertain the distance between these 2 pre-creation tekufot and moldot. In other words, now that we know that the first tekufa of Tishrei was Wednesday morning, and the first molad was Friday morning, and they were just 2 days apart, or 1 day and 23 hours if you think about it exactly, because it's 15 hours to 14 hours, 9 a.m. to 8 a.m., 47 hours apart. Now we can work backwards and figure out the distance between these two. How do we work backwards? So we learned yesterday, and the day before that also was mentioned, that every year the sun achieves a lead over the moon of about 10 days, 21 hours, and 204 units, I believe it was. 10, 21, 204. That means that in a half a year, the sun's lead over the moon is half of that, which is 5 days, 10 hours, and 5 days, 10 hours, and what's half of 204 is 102. What's half of 1,080 is 540. 642. 5 days, 10 hours, 642 units is the lead that the sun has over the moon over a half a year. So if at this point of creation, the Tekufas Tishrei, in other words, the sun, had a lead of 1 day and 23 hours until the moon would reach it, so there was a lead of the sun over the moon, 1 day, 23 hours, plus you go back a half a year, and you have an additional lead of the sun of 5 days, 10 hours, and 642 units, add 5, 10, 642 to 123, and you get 7, 9, 642. A lead of 7 days, 9 hours, 642 chalakim. And that means that at the time of Tekufas Nisan, this Tuesday night, pre-creation Tekufa, the sun was ahead of the moon by 7 days, 9 hours, and 642 units. That's what the Rambam means when he says, Tekufat Nisan, in the first year, it was before Molad Nisan, by 7 days, 9 hours, 642. Why is this important? Because this means that at the beginning point of our calculations, we must always assume a lead of the sun over the moon of this amount, 7, 9, 642. Now, the Rambam goes on to Halacha Daled to tell us how to calculate when any given Tekufa will be. And here we have to take the following into account. We know, we'll call this the essential lead of the sun over the moon. The essential lead of the sun over the moon is 7 days, 9 hours, 642 chalakim. Now, according to this understanding of the solar year, every 19 years, the gap closes by 1 hour and 485 units. Because remember, even at the end of 19 years, the moon is still behind by 1 hour, 485 chalakim. Which means that the moon is beginning its new cycle 1 hour and 485 chalakim earlier than 19 years ago, such that the gap between the sun and the moon is closing by that amount every 19 years. And so the Rambam says, Derech cheshbon tekufa kachi, the way to calculate when the tekufa, the beginning, the tekufa of Nisan we always go with, at the beginning of a cycle will be the following. And I just try to put this up on my screen so you can visualize it a little bit. Teidat Tchila, you must first find out Kama Machzorin Shleimim Mishnas HaYetzira Ad HaMachzor Shetirtze. Figure out how many complete cycles have passed since the moment of creation till the cycle which you wish to discover about. V'kach L'chol Machzor Mehen Shah Achas V'Tov Pei Hei Chalakim. Take, per every 19 years, take into your head 1 hour, 485 units. And I just wrote it 3 times and then I wrote etc. because if there's more Machzorim, you have to just keep adding. 1 hour, 485, 1 hour, 485, 1 hour, 485. Turn every unit of 1,080 units into an hour, and every 24 hours into a day. Whatever the total will be, let's say now we're in the 300th machzor, or after that. So we would have to take a lot of, is it 300 or 200? 200. It's 200, yeah. Not yeah. 200. 208. So yeah, so we're already past 200 cycles of 19 years. So imagine 200 hours, that's a lot of days, right? That's how much the sun and the moon have accumulated a difference over all these 19 years. Says the Rambam, V'tigra min hakoil. Once you've accumulated your number, subtract from it all. Shiva yamim v'teisha shois v'sheish meis v'shnayim v'arbayim chalakim. Subtract that essential lead that the sun had over the moon at the beginning of creation, or pre-creation, if you will. 7 days, 9 hours, 642 units. And now you have the current lead of the sun over the moon. And once you have the current lead of the sun over the moon, the hashar, whatever is left, toisif oisei al meilad nisan shal shana rishena min hamachzor, add it to whatever you know will be the first conjunction of Nisan. You have to figure that out too as well. Once you figure that out, add that number to the molad of Nisan. Yetzei lecha will come out for you be'ezei shal v'kama b'chodesh tiyat kufas Nisan shal oisei hashana min hamachzor. You will have the result of which hour and which day of the month the the tekufa of Nisan will be of that year in the cycle. From there you just begin to count 91 days, 7.5 hours from each season to the next season as well. Because what's happening here over here is, after every 19 years, you're taking an hour and 485 chalakim to accumulate for the remainder of the sun and the moon, which in this case is actually a lead of the moon over the sun, because the moon is starting the cycle earlier before the sun finishes its cycle. So you're adding all that up. Then you're taking away to compensate for the fact that the sun always has a lead over the moon since the beginning of creation. And then you're adding that, whatever number remains, to the mola, to the conjunction of Nisan, then you're going to know when the sun will enter the constellation of Aries. That's if you want to know when the tekufa will be at the beginning of a cycle. But if you want to know the tekufa of Nisan, in other words, when the sun will enter 0 degrees of a specific year within the cycle that you're standing in, so now it's a little more complex. You begin with the first step as before. You figure out how many full cycles have passed. Take an hour and 485 units per cycle. But then because you're within a cycle, you have to accumulate all the differences that have accumulated from the sun and the moon per each year. For every full year that has passed of the cycle, you must take also 10 days, 21 hours, 204 units per year. Gather everything. Now that you have the total, do the same second step, which is to add the essential lead of the sun over the moon pre-creation, that 7 day, 9 hour, 642 unit difference. V'hashar, whatever you remain with, tashlichem chodshei halavana, divide by lunar months. Tisha ve'esrim yom, u'shtei mesrei shoyis, u'shvam meis, shalosh tishim chalakim, 29.5 days, 793 parts. Okay, I just wrote 30 days to be more exact. The reason why you're dividing it by 30 days is because throughout the cycle, every couple of years, you keep on adding a month as a leap year to compensate for exactly this difference between the sun and the moon. So if you come up with a total that's greater than 30 days, just take off those 30 days, because those have already been compensated for. The calendar certainly has a leap year already there. Once you have an amount that remains less than a lunar month, you just add it to the time that you know is the conjunction of Nisan of that year. And you will then know when the tekufa of Nisan will be on that year, which day of the month, and which hour as well it will come out to be, because you've already added it using this mathematical calculation. Says the Rambam, Tekufas Nisan lefi cheshbon zeh. According to this calculation, where the solar year is exactly 365.25 hours, that everything divides neatly into 91 days and 7.5 hours, it comes out at the tekufa of Nisan, the moment of the vernal equinox, when the sun enters 0 degrees, will always be eino le'olam ela oy b'tchilas halayla, oy b'chatzi halayla, oy b'tchilas hayom, oy b'chatzi hayom. It could only be at 6 p.m., 12 a.m., 6 a.m., or 12 p.m. Why? Because if you think about it, if the tekufa of Nisan is at 6 p.m., and then you add 7.5 hours, 7.5 hours, 7.5 hours, 7.5 hours, that's a total of 30 hours till the next year at the same time. 30 hours is 24 hours plus 6 hours. So the difference could only be a difference of 6 hours. From 6 p.m. to 12 a.m., from 12 a.m. to 6 a.m., from 6 a.m. to 12 p.m. Same thing with Tekufas Tammuz. Le'olam eina, ela oy b'sheva shayis u'mechza, oy b'shah achas u'mechza, bein bayom, bein balayla. It can only be at 7.5 hours into the day, or 1.5 hours into the day or night. 1:30 a.m., 7:30 a.m., 1:30 p.m., 7:30 p.m. Utkufas Tishrei, lo'olam eina ela b'teisha shoyis, oy b'shalosh shoyis, bein bayom, bein balayla. The Tekufa of Tishrei, which goes at another 7.5 hours, can only be at 9 hours into the day or 3 hours into the day. 3 a.m., 9 a.m., 3 p.m., 9 p.m. Utkufas Teves, lo'olam eina ela oy be'eser shoyis u'mechza, oy ba'arba shoyis u'mechza, bein bayom, bein balayla. And the winter solstice can only be at 10.5 hours into the day or 4.5 hours into the day or night. Again, that's 4:30 a.m., 10:30 a.m., 4:30 p.m., 10:30 p.m. Okay. Now, the Rambam jumps to a whole different type of calculation. And this takes into account what the Rambam just said. The fact that different kufot can only be at their specific times. If you follow the math from year to year. Tekufas Nisan, the moment that the spring begins, jumps 30 hours. So if it's on Tuesday night at 6 p.m., in year 0, in year 1 it'll be on Thursday, 12 a.m. Go another 30 hours, it's Friday, 6 a.m. in year 2. Go another 30 hours, it's Shabbat, 12 p.m. in year 3. And just keep on following. It goes back to 6 p.m., but now it's on Sunday, 6 p.m. 12 a.m., 6 a.m., 12 p.m., back to 6 p.m., da-da-da-da. Keep on following. In year 28, you just follow the math, it's simple math, 30 hours times 28, it'll be back to Tuesday night at 6 p.m. Every 28 years, the sun returns to its original position that it was in the moment of creation, which is, by the way, why we make Birkat HaChama, the blessing of the sun, every 28 years. That celebrates, on Wednesday morning, because on Tuesday night, the sun comes back into position. Wednesday morning is the daytime, and we can see the sun the first time, so we make the blessing. Knowing this, that every 28 years the sun returns to its same position on the same day of the week, says the Rambam, Im tirtza leida be'ezeh yom yimei hashavua, u'be'ezeh shah tiyah tekufa. If you wish to know which day of the week and which hour the tekufa will be, you don't care about the day of the month. All you want to know is which weekday will be the tekufa. Kach shanim gemurais sha'avru mishnas hayitzira ad shanim shetirtza. Forget cycles, 19-year cycles. We're just going now with 28-year cycles. Figure out how many years have passed since creation till the year that you desire. V'hashlech hakoil shmeina ve'esrim. And throw it away. Divide it by groups of 28, 28. Because every 28 years, the tekufa of Nisan is again at the same moment of the same week. Same day of the week. The hanisha yoser mishmeina ve'esrim, whatever remains after 28, kach l'chol shana yom echad sheish. Per year, take those 30 hours, 1 day and 6 hours, because that's the amount that the sun moves, that the tekufa moves from year to year. V'kabetz hakoil, add it all together. V'hoisef alav shloisha, then add 3 days. We're going to say in a moment why you have to add 3 days, because if you start your count from Sunday, the first tekufa wasn't on a Saturday night. It wasn't on a Sunday, it was Tuesday night. So you have to add those 3 days to make up for the difference. V'hashlech hakoil shiva, then divide everything by 7, because that'll be full weeks. V'hanishar min hayomim min hashayos, whatever remains after 7 days and hours, paschil limnes mitchilas leil echad b'Shabbos, simply begin to count from Saturday night of Sunday, v'la'asher yagiya hacheshbein b'tiyah tekufas Nisan, wherever the calculation brings you, that will be the tekufa of Nisan. V'lama meisifin shleisha, why do we add 3 in the middle of the calculation? L'fishet tekufa rishayna shal shnas yitzira, haisa b'tchilas leil revi, because the first season, the first equinox of creation was on the beginning of a Wednesday, so you have to add those 3 days to make up for it. And the Rambam will immediately give us an example so we can visualize it with our eyes. Halacha hey, Ketzah, what does this look like? Leida tekufas Nisan shel shnas cham me'ay shleishim v'arbas alafim liyitzira. The commentaries point out that Rambam seems to give us the year when he wrote this book. Mm-hmm. If we want to know the beginning of the vernal equinox of the year 4,930 since creation. So, take a calculator, okay? It says the Rambam, kishetashlich hakoil shmeina ve'esrim. If you divide it by 28, so you have 4,930, I'm dividing it by 28, it equals 176 point whatever. So, it's 176 full cycles, and there's a remainder of 1. Because look, if you do 4, 9, 28, divided by 28 equals exactly 176. So the Rambam says, Tishar Shana Achas. They'll remain 1 year. Now, why is he saying 1 year? It's really 2 years. But that's because he's trying to figure out the Tekufas Nisan in the year 4930. So the count ends at 4929. So if you divide really 4929 by 28, you have a remainder of 1. It's 176 full cycles plus a remainder of 1 year. Tikach la yom echad v'sheish. Take for that year the 30 hours. That's how much the tekufa will move from year to year. The toisif alav shalish, add 3 to compensate for the difference from Saturday night to Tuesday night. And you're going to begin to count from Saturday night. So you have 4 days and 6 hours. Nimtzeis tekufas Nisan b'leil chamishi sheish balayla. Turns out that the tekufa of Nisan that year will be on Wednesday night, 6 hours into the night. It's year 1, Thursday, 12 a.m. Ukisha toisif aleha sheva shayis umechza. Add to that 7.5 hours. Because the next tekufa will be 91 days, 7.5 hours later, but 91 days is exactly divisible by 7. So all you have to do is add 7.5 hours. Haretia tekufas Tammuz b'sha'o mechza miyem chamishi. You then know that the tekufa of Tammuz, the summer solstice, will be Thursday morning 7.5 hours later, 7:30 a.m.
7:30?
Yeah.
Right, 7.5 hours.
7.5 hours, 1.5 hours after sunrise. Add another 7.5 hours. The tekufa of Tishrei, the autumnal equinox will be 9 hours into the day, 3 p.m. on Thursday. Add another 7.5 hours. The winter solstice will be 4.5 hours in the night of Friday, 1:30 a.m. on Thursday night. Another 7.5 hours you add. The next Tekufas Nisan of the year 4931 will be B'tchilas Yom Shishi at the beginning of Thursday night, 6 p.m. And you can go year after year for eternity to figure out one season after the next, one equinox after the next. Halacha Vav, the Rambam gives an extremely approximate calculation for somebody who's super interested in specifically figuring out which day of the month the beginning of the Tekufa will be. He doesn't want to know the week, doesn't want anything, just wants to know which day of the month is it going to be. Hey Nisan, Vav Nisan, Aleph Nisan, when's it going to be? If you want to know which day of the month will be the vernal equinox of this year. So the Rambam is going to give us the calculation. Again, it's very approximate because he doesn't really care about getting the exact date, as we'll see. Because you're going to use other factors that will help equal it out. So the Rambam says you have to come into the calculation armed with some info. You already have to know the last calculation, which day of the week is it going to be. At least know, is it a Tuesday, a Wednesday? Figure out which day of the week it's going to be. You have to also know when is going to be Rosh Chodesh of the month of Nisan, which means you already know the time of conjunction, and you already know when Rosh Chodesh is going to be. Then figure out how many cycles passed in the current cycle that you're in, of the 19 years. Per year, take 11 days. Even though the difference between sun and the moon every year is a little less than that, 10 days, 21 hours, a very exact number, the Rambam here is approximate, take 11 days per year.
Because you need to match it up with the lunar
Exactly.
cycle.
But we don't care to do it exactly, we just care to do it generally. Then you have to add to the total 7 days in these times. What does it mean 7 days in these times? It's like I said before, the sun, according to this calculation, has an essential lead of 7 days, 9 hours, 642 units. Every 19 years, that difference is getting smaller by an hour and 485 parts. If you follow the math, after 1900 years or so, the sun and the moon have become so close together that actually the moon begins to lead the sun. And the molad of Nisan begins to happen before Tekufas Nisan, unlike in the beginning, pre-creation. Tekufas Nisan was before molad Nisan. Because of all these cycles closing the gap, now, as the calendar actually is today, the Tekufa of Nisan is always after, and sometimes way after, the molad of Nisan. In the Rambam's times, that distance was about 7 days. If you do the math exactly, it's like almost 8 days, essentially. But the Rambam says just take 7 days, it's easier.
One more time?
Year 0,
Yeah.
here's the sun, here's the moon.
Yeah.
Separation of 7 days, 9 hours, 642 parts. At year 19, the moon begins its new cycle 1 hour and 485 parts before the sun. Right?
Because the sun's is longer.
It's a little longer. So the gap now closes by an hour and 485 units. It's very small. But after 190 years, it closed by 10 hours. After 1900 years, it closed by 100 hours. After 3800 years, it closed by 200 hours, way more. 200 hours is a couple of days, right? And it got so far that the lines actually crossed. And now the conjunction happens before the Tekufa. By the way, one of the big questions on the Rambam, the commentaries ask, what's going to happen if the distance gets so far that the Tekufa can end up happening after Pesach? It's so far ahead. How will Pesach fall in the spring? So the classic answer is that it's only going to happen after the year 6000. If you do the math, only after Mashiach comes. So the Pirush says, Yavo Moret Tzedek V'Yodienu. Mashiach will come, will give us the answer to how to do that. But nowadays, it is about 13, 14 days. But in the Rambam's time, it's about 7 days. 7, 8 days. So therefore, you have to add those 7 days. The Hashlich HaKol Shloishim Shloishim. Then, divide everything by 30. Again, the Rambam's not being exact. Really, you should divide it by 29 days, 12 hours, a proper lunar month. Divide it by 30. That's the 30-day months that have already been incorporated to compensate for the difference in lunar and solar cycles every leap year. V'hanishar pachas mishloishim, whatever remains from 30, taschilim noisan mirish chedesh Nisan, begin to count from the new month of Nisan. Now, you already know which day is Rosh Chodesh and which day of the week the Tekufa will be. So you can now match these two calculations. Im yagia liyom Tekufa, if the number which you have reaches the day that you already know when the Tekufa will be, mutav, that's good. You've matched and you know the day of the month. V'im lav, if not, hoisif yoyim, shnei yamim, shleisha yamim alaminyan, just keep adding 1, 2, 3 days, ad sheyagia liyom Tekufa, till it reaches the day of the Tekufa. Because this whole calculation was approximate, so anyways, we've been adding more extra days. So if you come up with a difference of 1, 2, 3 days, don't worry. You already know which day of the week it's going to be, so you'll force the calculation to move to match that day of the week. If it's a leap year, begin to count from the beginning of the second Adar, and that's when the Tekufa will be. In a leap year, the Tekufa is always earlier. Whatever day the calculation reaches, that's the day of the month which the Tekufa will be. And the Rambam again visualizes it. Zayin Ketzat. Again, or it should be missing about alafim. Okay, if we want to know when the Tekufa, which date of the month it will be, of the year 4930, so in Halacha Hey, we calculate which day of the week it is. We know it's going to be on Wednesday night, right? We said Wednesday night, yes. So we know which day it's going to be. This year, 4930, is the 9th year of the 260th cycle. No, we are in 308 this year. Yeah, 260th cycle. Matzanu Rosh Chodesh Nisan nikva baba chamishi. So we figured out that Rosh Chodesh will be on Thursday. Utkufas Nisan b'chamishi. And we know the equinox will also be on Thursday, Wednesday night. Because it's the 9th year of the cycle, so we have 8 complete years that have already elapsed. Per year, take 11 days. 8 times 11, 88 days. Taisif Shiva, add 7 days, again in Rambam's times. 95 days. Tashlich HaKol Shleishim Shleishim, divided by 30, Nisharu Chamisha Yamim, you have 5 days. Count 5 days from the new month, which we know is going to be on the Thursday. It comes to Monday, Thursday, Friday, Shabbat, Sunday, Monday, 5 days. But we know that it's going to be on a Thursday, 3 days later. No problem. We already know that the Tekufa is only going to be not on Monday, but on Thursday. Just add 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, till we reach the day of the Tekufa, which is Thursday. So you comes out at the calendar date is the 8th day of the month of Nisan for the Tekufa, for the equinox. And that's how you do it every single year. Now the Rambam just gives one caveat. When I say to add a day after day till you reach the day of the Tekufa, you should only have to add 1, 2, or 3 days maximum. It's very rare. You'll have to add 4 days. It's only if all the approximations totally will reach more than 3 days, you'll have to add 4 days of difference. But usually it's 1, 2, 3 days. If you ever reach more than that, if you find you have to add a day, you can know for sure that you made an error in your calculations, and go back and recalculate precisely till you can reach the exact date of the month that the Tekufa, the vernal equinox, will be.